Wanted Baruch Hashem, I'd like to talk about today. First, the journeys of the children of Israel in the wilderness. Second of all, after we talk about the journey of the children of Israel in the wilderness, I want to talk about that's the beginning of Parshas Masei. And after that, I would like to talk about the vows that a father has the right to annul of his daughter. I would like to talk about that. And the third is we could talk about the tribes of Reuben and Gad and half of Manasseh. So first of all, we talk about the 42 journeys. And this is something which appears in the beginning of Midbar, Parshas Masei, chapter 33. It says, Ewa Masei b'nei Yisrael, these are the journeys of Israel. Asher Yatzu Me'eretz Mitzrayim with Tzivosam, they left the land of Egypt, according to their region, beyond Moshe ve'Aaron. The hands of Moshe and Aaron. Vayichtov Moshe es motzeihem u'maseihem. Moshe wrote their goings forth according to their journeys. Hold on one second. So there are 42 journeys that are recorded. And we're going to list all of their journeys now. It says they traveled from Ramses, and what happened in Ramses in the first day of the first month on the 15th day, the day after Pesach, they traveled. Verse 4, Mitzrayim mekabrim et hasher hika Hashem mahem kol b'chor. And the Egyptians are busy burying the firstborn. And Hashem inflicted punishments. They traveled from Ramses, they traveled to Sukkos. And traveled from Sukkos, they camped in Etam. They traveled from Etam, they camped Piachirot. And then they camped before Migdol. And they traveled from Piachirot and they traveled through the sea. And then they traveled 3 days and they traveled to Mara. And they traveled from Mara to Elima. And Elim, there were 12 springs of water and 70 dates. And they camped there. And they traveled from Elim. They camped by the Yam Suf, and they traveled from the Yam Suf, and they camped in Sin, Midbar Sin. And from Midbar Sin, they traveled to Dafka, to Aush, to Berfidim. There was no water there for people to drink. And then they camped in the Midbar Sin, and it goes through all these 42 journeys. And some of them we have a narrative about them in Torah, but others we don't. And so the question is, why do we need these 42 journeys to be listed? This is something that I think about a lot because the 42 journeys is something that's actually relevant to the writing of the Torah. Does anybody know how it's relevant to the writing of the Torah, the 42 journeys? So, anybody know? So the answer is that most Torah scrolls today have 42 lines. It wasn't always like that. In the older Torahs, it was more lines. But today, it's certainly the custom in America, and it's pretty universal today, that every column of the Torah has 42 lines. 42 lines. And one of the reasons is it corresponds to the 42 journeys in the wilderness. So that's something that I think about a lot. I had the idea because I saw in one of the I saw one of the writings that they said that you should write a Torah with more lines, because if you write it with more lines, then it would be actually go quicker, because their argument was that the scribes say I'm going to do a page a day. So if you made the page 50 lines or 60 lines, then they would finish quicker. Also be a little cheaper because each piece of parchment cost a lot of money. It costs like $125. So if you do like this, there's less pieces of parchment. And he had an argument. Let me see if I can find it. Hold on. Let me see. Hold on. I can't find it. Oh, here we go. Can you hear me? Okay, I'll write it like this. That this guy writes here. It says as follows. It says, okay, hold on. In order for me to read this, I have this as a phone, as a picture on my phone. So I need to go off of the screen. So that's why it looks like maybe you won't see my face. But if you can't hear me, now let me know. Okay. So I'm just reading it. Hold on. So the sages command. I found this person wrote this. The sages commanded that it's a zekel ivamveh, which means that you have to make the most beautiful Torah, and you have to, and so therefore you have to make the most beautiful Torah possible. And so therefore this is the most beautiful idea. So sometimes it used to be, they said that they would write the Torah scroll with between every column in the Torah scroll be between 48 to 60 lines. And that's what it says in the Shulchan Aruch. And also today, even many synagogues, these guys writing in Israel, if you look at old Torah scrolls, they have between 48 to 60 lines. And in fact, there are some tikkunim that have Torah scrolls with 60 lines in each column. And now, however, everybody writes 42 lines. 42 lines. That's all everybody writes. You won't find anybody who writes a Torah scroll that's not 42 lines. Even though he says there are some people do 48, but almost everybody writes 42. He says, so what should we do? Should we write 42 or 48? And he asked a lot of scribes who are experts and a lot of Torah scrolls if there's any specific reason or just that's how it happened. And he said, I got the answer that it's not because of the 42 journeys in the wilderness, but rather it's because of a technical reason, because the people, and this is what's his argument, even though we have like ancient reasonings that say that the Torah scroll 42 lines corresponds to the 42 journeys. That's just a coincidence. His argument was, he said that the people who sold the parchment wanted to sell more parchment. And so therefore, they made it shorter. They made it 42 lines as opposed to 48 or even 60. And he says, the Kesed HaSofer says that really, the Kesed HaSofer is the preeminent work with respect to writing a scroll. It says that ideally the Torah scroll should be 48 lines. And so he says also that he brings a couple of other sources, and also a Sefer Torah that's made with 48 lines will have 8 fewer pieces of parchment. Now, each piece of parchment cost around $125. So you're saving $1,000 basically, maybe a little bit more. So he says maybe you should do it for that reason, and that's why they were not doing it. But then he goes on, he says, also if it's 8 fewer pieces of parchment, it's also weighs less. It'll be easier to lift it up. And then more people can have the mitzvah of doing the Hagbah. And also it says, anyway, he says if he has in mind to write 1 column a day, then he's going to finish it quicker, because you can push yourself to do an extra 6 lines a day. Let's say it takes an extra half hour. And so then he says everything will be great. So anyway, I had this idea. This guy wrote this, and so I told my son to go ask Rav Schechter, who's the Rosh Yeshiva University, the posek of America. I said, as Rav Schechter, should I write the Torahs with 48 lines instead of 42 lines? Because this person makes this compelling argument. And what do you think he said? What do you think he said? He said, no, you should follow the custom of America. If the custom of America is 42 lines, then you should write 42 lines. So even though this person made a compelling argument, So therefore, we have to say that we correspond to the journeys in the wilderness. That's where we are. We correspond to the journeys in the wilderness, even though the Torah scrolls used to be written with 48 lines. So that's the first thing. Are you raising your hand, Stanley? Okay. I'm not sure. Okay, fine. So what's the reason why all the journeys in the Torah need to be listed? So we'll read the Rashi here. I'm going to do a deep dive into this Rashi. We'll try to understand it. The Rashi says like this. It says, Ela Masei, these are the journeys of the children of Israel. Now, we also have to realize that this really was the conclusion of the book of Bamidbar, which is in many ways a conclusion of the Torah, because the Devarim is basically like a coda. It's like Moshe Rabbeinu's speech. It is Moshe Rabbeinu's speech. So this might have been like coming to the end, where like you're talking about all the journeys. So Elamase, Lama Nichtavu Hamasaot Halalu. Why were these journeys even written? Why do we have to write these journeys? Many of them, we don't even know where they are today. We don't even know where Sinai really is. I mean, we have our very strong theory, which I believe, but we don't even know. So why are they writing it down? So Rashi gives two explanations. The first explanation of Rashi is Lodia Chasadav Shel Makom. The journeys show God's tremendous kindness. He's showing God's tremendous kindness. How do all these journeys show Hashem's tremendous kindness? How do these journeys show Hashem's tremendous kindness? So that's something that Rashi is going to explain. How do the journeys show Hashem's tremendous kindness? Even though Hashem made a decree that we're going to wander in the wilderness for 40 years, Lo Tomar Shayu Na'imu Mimtaltalim Mimasala Masa. Don't say that the Bnei Israel were traveling from journey to journey. Don't think that we never had a good night's sleep while we were in the wilderness. If you ever travel, it's exhausting. So the reason why it lists the 42 journeys in the wilderness is not to say we were being punished, but to say that Hashem was mitigating that punishment. We might have thought, oh, it was torture, 40 years of just wandering in the wilderness. No, says Rashi, just the opposite. It's telling us we only had 42 stops. We weren't traveling every night. We only had 42 stops, and it's even better than that. So what? How so? Because it says Sharei Inkan Ela Arbaimu Shtayim Maso, because you only have here 42 journeys. It's only 42 journeys. Only 42 journeys. Not I Gevalt 42 journeys, but only 42 journeys. It's all how you look at it. You can look at something and see it with tremendous pessimism, or you can look at something and see it with tremendous optimism. So don't look at this 42 journeys as look at the torture we went through. Every night we were traveling a different location, and we come to 42 journeys. What you imagine having to move 42 times in your lifetime? Sounds like a very unsettled life. Just the opposite, says Rashi, based upon the Midrash. There were only 42 stops in the wilderness. Only 42. What a compassionate punishment that God gave us. And first of all, when you come to the 42, when you count the 42, you realize it's even better than that. It's not even as bad as that. Say, ma'am, our boss, Ray, you have to take out 14 right away. Only 14. What do you mean? So there's really only 28 stops. What do you mean 14? Why are you taking 14? Shekuam ayu b'shana rishona chodem gezerah. Because 14 of those 42 were in the first year, before it was a punishment. It was just we were traveling to the land of Canaan. So we had 42 even before we were punished. And obviously those were just like the Exodus. So 14 of them were clearly not a punishment. So actually, only 28 of them were a punishment. So now all of a sudden we have only 28 stops in 39 years. It's nothing, Rashi's saying. And Mishabo Miramses Achabo Ritma. From the time that they came to Ramses until they came When there were 14 stops. From Ritma, that's where they sent out the spies, and that's where the decree happened that they were sentenced. And it says, "Va'achar nasu mechatzerot, shlachacha anoshim, v'chanu omer v'yasu mechatzerot v'yachanu b'ritma." So we learned from here that Ritma was in the Paran wilderness. So Rashi says, right away, he calculates it. He says, right away, we're talking about only 28 stops in 39 years. Good, beautiful. And then he says, actually, we could deduct even more. You could deduct another 8 stops, which happened after the death of Aaron. That happened in the 40th year. We know that after Aaron died, they did another 8 stops. They went backwards. They did another 8 stops. So actually now, it's only 20 stops in 38 years. That's already not so bad. For a tribe with a tent, not a big deal. 20 stops in 38 years. So therefore, Nimtza Shekol Shmono Shloshim Shana Onasu Ela Esrim Masaot. The whole 38 years, they only did 20 stops. Zemi Yisodosh Moshe Darshan. So this is from the teachings of Rabbi Moshe Darshan, which he preceded Rashi by like 100 years. So the first approach is to say, why is it listing the 42 journeys? To show us it wasn't so bad. We're traveling in the wilderness, not as bad as we're making it out to be. God mitigated our punishment. God mitigated our punishment with his great compassion. That's the first approach of the Rashi. Then Rashi is going to give us a second approach, which is slightly different. Hold on 1 second. We'll take this question. I'm excited to hear it. Baruch Hashem. For those of you who are watching on YouTube, Morris just pointed out to our Chevra here that the Gutenberg Bible was written with 42 lines, and that was just for convenience to match the vellum, to match certain things. But there is this very provocative concept now that the Gutenberg Bible had 42 lines and our standard Torah scrolls have 42 lines. So we'd have to research that more if there is a relationship between the two. Okay, so now Baruch Hashem, the Rashi gives us a second explanation. Rashi tells us another reason why all the journeys were listed. Rashi says the Rebbe Tanchuma Darish Bo Drasha Cheres. Rebbe Tanchuma, normally we refer to this as the Midrash Tanchuma. Here Rashi is saying Rebbe Tanchuma. Maybe there was a rabbi whose name was Tanchuma. That's hard to imagine. Everybody just calls it the Midrash Tanchuma. So, but anyway, Rashi refers to the Rebbe Tanchuma, says a different drasha. Mashal and Melech, there's a parable of a king, Shahaya benu Chola, who had a sick son. He kept taking him to a distant place, to cure him. Once they started on their journey back, the father began to count all of the journeys. Amar lo kan yashanu, kanu karnu, kan chashashtes roshecha v'kulu. He said to his son, here we slept, here we felt cold, here you had a headache. So he's recounting everything. So basically, the Maharal of Prague's explanation of this is the king recapitulated for his son all that he had gone through to remind his son of how much he loves him. So Hashem is recapitulating for Bnei Israel the events of their journey to remind them of his love for them and inspire them to reciprocate. We slept, says that that's the time that Jewish people had everything. We were cold, that represents the times they were lacking. You had a headache, represents the time Israel was in danger. The Maharal is saying that the journeys represent that all the ups and downs, and we were remembering them because it's only in retrospect can you have perspective. It's only in retrospect you could have perspective how Hashem was with you every step of the way. It's at the time we're often unable to realize just how much Hashem is holding our hand. It's only when we look back on 40 years, if every one of us on this call looks back 40 years and looks at these 40 years and recognizes how Hashem was holding our hand the whole time, and we start looking back on our life, and we realize the tremendous love that Hashem has demonstrated for us. And that's the idea here. When you look back, you see the incredible times, the incredible journeys. Here we slept, here we were cold, and all together we see a narrative of Hashem taking care of us. That's the message of this Rashi. It's a beautiful message of this Rashi, and it's a teaching for us. It's a responsibility for us that this is our responsibility, that we're supposed to, at certain points in our life, take reflection and look back at it. Well, yes, 1 second, and then April or Bruce, and then I want to say something from the Rebbe. So Bavitcher Rebbe discusses this. He discusses why Rashi needs two explanations. Again, the first explanation was to show that there was only actually 20 stops in 38 years. And the second explanation is to remind us of all the places we stopped, to look back with perspective. So the Rebbe gave a sicha about this. The Rebbe gave a talk about this. And the Rebbe writes, whenever Rashi brings two interpretations, it's because each has a significant problem, which is compensated for by the other explanation. So it's just teaching us how do we read the Rashi, because there's always a problem which the other one compensates for. So what's going on here? So he says also another point that he's bothered by is Rabbi, that he says there's an unusual language in the text of the Rashi. It says Rabbi Tanchum Darish Bo Drasha Acheret. Rabbi Tanchum made a different explanation. He says this is an unusual phrase. Rashi normally would just write another opinion, but in this case he says Rabbi Tanchum made a different exposition. So it's an unusual phrase. So the Rebbe says as follows. According to Rav Moshe Darshan, that was the first approach. It says it was only 20 stops in 38 years. So he says, if this was the reason why the Torah recorded this, to tell us that Hashem only made us stop 20 times in 38 years, then there's an obvious question on that approach, because the Torah should have just mentioned those 20 stops. These are the journeys of the children of Israel in the wilderness for 38 years. These are the 20 stops they went to. And that would have been very clear about that. So why are they adding in the other 22 stops, which are not showing God's kindness? They're just making it seem like there were more stops than there were. So that's a big problem with the explanation of Rabbi Moshe Darshan. And so because of that, Rashi has to cite the second approach, which is of Rabbi Tanchuma, that this is the time to look back with perspective and see how Hashem embraced us and held us during all the journeys in the wilderness. By the way, I would encourage everybody to look back at the last 40 years and look how Hashem has embraced us and held us over the last 40 years. It says, the Rebbe, Hashem was recalling, quote unquote, so to speak, all the journeys in the wilderness, even though that have occurred in different locations. But there's a problem. There's a problem, as Bruce was pointing out. If you're saying that the point was to recall all those places we stopped, the problem is that journeys 16 through 33 are recorded here for the first time. They're not recorded anyplace else. And so there's nothing that we're recalling about those encampments. There's nothing significant about it, saying here I slept or here I got a headache. It's not saying that. So there doesn't appear to be any special events associated with them. And so therefore, Rabbi Moshe Darshan is telling us why we need the middle journeys, to tell us those are the only journeys we had. And the Tanchuma is explaining why we need 1 through 15 and also 34 through 42, because they're explaining the parts where there is a lot of significance. And so that's why we need the two approaches. But the Rabbi then goes a step further. He says, Rashi's two explanations on a deeper level relate to two perspectives of life and the afterlife. Okay, so this is where you see the Rebbe takes us to an even deeper level. He says, Ramosha Darshan spoke about the journeys and their difficulties as they were experienced at the time. Despite the harshness of wandering in the desert for 40 years, they were nevertheless grateful for the kindness of God, meaning say, even though there were people dying and they weren't getting into their dream, they were grateful that Hashem made their journey easier. They recognized that they only journeyed 20 times in 38 years. Rabbi Tanchuma, however, spoke from the other perspective, the perspective of the end of life or the afterlife. And we recall that every setback was really a prelude to reaching greater heights. You say, I had a headache, but then I came to this place. And these are all, you're going through all the problems of your life. But at the end, you get to where you need to go. You're getting to the journey, one step closer to entering into the land of Canaan. And that's the Rebbe Tanchuma's approach. That the first approach is teaching us at the moment, even while we're struggling, to realize how Hashem is giving us the kindness. And the second approach is when we look back on life, we're able, with perspective, to realize that every setback was actually a way of bringing us closer to our ultimate journey of coming closer to Hashem. So one last thing that the Rebbe says here is that these two approaches are found in the names of the people who offer them, Rabbi Moshe Darshan and Rabbi Tanchuma. Tanchuma is, we'll get to it in a moment because it's easier, but the name Moshe comes like drawing down from heavens, where Moshe means to draw. And so he says, basically, he was saying that it was the view of the soul within the body, i.e. that God was with us the whole time. We're drawing down from Hashem. Whereas Tanchuma is the perspective, means to comfort. And it's that as we look back in life, we're comforted. And when we see the struggles, actually they were bringing us to a place that we were actually seeking for. So this is the perspective of the Rebbe on these journeys. And to my mind, the journeys, some of the most, it's just such a passionate and deeply emotional, to read about the journeys. If you sit with somebody and they tell you all the journeys they went through to get to this point, it's a very, very it's a very powerful idea when you think about how many journeys have each of us gone through to get to where we are in our place. Everything is a journey. So that's the Rebbe. There are other approaches who look at these journeys in a similar way, also in a very mystical way, a spiritual way, emotional way. The Shla Kadosh says the following: Ela Masei b'nei Yisrael. These are the journeys And he writes as follows: Hamasaot, the journeys are a remez, they're a hint to Galiot, to our exiles, and they're also an atonement. So he says, so to somebody who goes and travels for the purpose of studying Torah, and he puts himself through this hardship to reach a spiritual goal, is continuing in this spirit of the journeys of the children of Israel. That's why it says in the Haggadah, how does one of the narratives of the Haggadah start? Stay ulamad, go out and learn. Go out and learn. So the essence of how we come close to Hashem is through being willing to journey, being willing to take risks upon ourselves in order to come close to Torah. Our yeshiva is named for Rebbe Elimelech. Rebbe Elimelech was famous for so many wonderful things, but the most famous of all was before he revealed himself to the world as a Rebbe, he and his brother Reb Zusha set out on a journey. They would wander. They wandered. They said we have to go through this process of wandering. And there's this process of wandering was what helped him become the Rebbe. If he hadn't gone through this process of wandering, he never would become the Rebbe. There's a story. Hold on, let me get this. I want to get the story 100% right. So let me just look it up for a second. Just give me 1 second and I'll get it right. Hold on. I need to look it up. I don't want to get it wrong. Hold on 1 second. Okay, fine. Okay, so the story is as follows. That Rebbe Elimelech, before he revealed himself, he went out on a traveling with his brother. And then after a few years, he started coming back to his town. And he came back to his town, came to the outskirts of the town, and he heard people crying, and people were crying. And he says, "What's going on?" They said there's a little boy, Elazar, who's very, very sick, and everybody's saying, to him, we're very worried about his life. His life is hanging by a balance. So Rebbe Elimelech's son was Elazar. And so he said, oh my, he heard this. He's coming at the outskirts of town. He heard that his son Elazar was so sick. So he ran home frantically. He came running in. And he said to his wife, where's Elazar? Where's Elazar? And his wife says, what are you talking about? Elazar's in school. He said, no, I just heard Elazar's life is, he's hanging by a balance. I just heard that he's very sick and his life is hanging by a balance. And his wife said, no, that's not our Elazar. That's down the block. That's another boy named Elazar. He said, oh, thank God. Thank God. And then he realized and he felt relief that this other boy was sick and not his own son, but he felt relief at this other boy being sick. He wasn't in anguish. He said, I need to go back out on my journey. And he turned around and went back on his journey because he realized he wasn't ready yet to be the Rebbe because he wasn't feeling the pain. So you see that the journeying is necessary for us to achieve our spiritual greatness. This is a powerful idea that the journeys are necessary. The Rambam says in Laws of Tshuva that if a person has committed a sin and they want to achieve atonement, then what they need to do is to go on journey. You need to go into exile, journey, because it's through journey that we achieve humility, through leaving our place. Sometimes people also can come to a place in life where they're afraid to journey, they're afraid to go out and take on new risks, new responsibilities. and they're very comfortable with it where they are, and then we stop growing. That's very, very. Um, so this is what the Sifsei Tzadikim writes along this level. He says this world is called the world of preparation. A person needs every day to fix what he did yesterday. Angels are called omdim. Angels are people who are always standing. They're always standing in one level, and they have no need to fix what they did in the past. But human beings are not like that. Human beings are always going from one step to another. And that's what it means. These are the journeys of Israel. Whenever it says the word Elah, it says Elah Masei b'nei Israel. Whenever it says the word Elah, but it really means but knocks out the previous word. The previous, and that means here, the previous days require fixing. And so therefore, that means to say they always were camping and traveling. They were always trying to reach a higher and higher level. That's what the Sifsei Tzadikim says. Shemi Shmuel also talks about the spiritual concept of journeys. The Shemi Shmuel is the Sakachava Rebbe. He says that when it says these are the journeys of the Israel in the wilderness, that this is the reference to the many journeys that the children of Israel took in our history, in our exile from the land of Israel for 2,000 years before the return to Israel under Zionism. And this is how the elders of Kutsk said this. The miracles that were done for the Jewish people in our exile, nobody can understand them. Only God knows. Only God understands them. And they're written down in heaven. And in the future, there will be a book about them. And in these journeys that we don't even understand what they are, journeys, we just said, journeys 15 to 33, which there's no reference to, one day, they'll all be revealed to us. They're all relating not to the past journeys, but to the journeys in Jewish history from the destruction of the temple. This is the period of the 3 weeks. So these journeys are being hinted to in the Torah. That's what the Hasidic interpretation of this is. So that's the idea here, that the journeys are something that we need to embrace to help us recognize that this is our path to achieving an even higher goal, that our exile was part of a necessary preparation to achieving a spiritual fulfillment of coming closer to Hashem. So that's what we discussed today. The journeys of Bnei Yisrael, the journeys, first of all, show how Hashem was with us the whole time. It wasn't as bad as we thought, but at the same time, we look back on them with perspective and recognize how Hashem helped us in every moment, but also at the same time, the journeys were necessary as part of our spiritual refinement. Journeys are necessary, our exile, and journeys were necessary for our spiritual refinement even today. When we're willing to go on a journey to achieve our spiritual destination, it takes a brave person to be willing to do that, but that's what this portion is hinting to. I'll stop here. I'll take any questions if anybody has any questions.